Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We start the new chapter 5090 O level or GCSE or IGCSE biology, and this is the new syllabus 2023. We are now going to be discussing 16.3, chapter 16. The component is 16.3, which is the heading is sexual reproduction in plants. Now we start everything with Bismillah, and we start with Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, in the name of Allah, the most beneficent and the most merciful. Please remember, whenever you start your studies or anything, please start with Bismillah Rahman Rahim. This will help you to gain knowledge and will help you to study better. Now, as we look at the sexual reproduction in plants, what are the main syllabus points that we have to do or the learning outcomes? Identify and draw the sepals, petals, stamens, carpels of an insect pollinated flower. Then identify and draw the anthers and stigma of a wind pollinated flower. Then relate the structure of the parts of the flower to the functions limited to the listed in 16.3.1, which is this one. Then compare the flower structure of the pollen from insect and wind pollinator. So we have to study the structure of the pollen. Then outline the process of pollination and distinguish between self and cross-pollination. Then discuss the potential effects of self-pollination and cross-pollination on a population in terms of variation, capacity to respond to changes in the environment, and reliance on pollinators. Describe the growth of the pollen tube and its entry into the ovule, followed by fertilization. Understand that after fertilization, the ovules develop into seeds and the ovary becomes the fruit. So when you're eating an apple, you're actually eating an ovary. So it's the fruit. Investigate and describe the structure of a seed limited to embryo, radicle, plumule, and cotyledons, and testa. Then part 10, understand that seed and fruit dispersal by wind and by animals is a means of colonizing new areas and of reducing competition. Relate the features of the wind dispersed fruit and animal dispersed fruits. Investigate and state the environmental conditions that affect germination of seeds limited to suitable temperature, water, and oxygen, and the mnemonic for this becomes TWO, temperature, water, and oxygen. And describe the process of germination, including the role of enzymes. So I'm going to be discussing this in this video, this entire 16.3, inshallah. Now, just a quick recap of the parts of the plant, which is a very basic thing. Flower, the flower makes seeds for the plant. Stem, the stem supports the plant. It contains the tubes for carrying food materials, minerals, and water, so it contains the xylem and the phloem. The leaves make food for the plant. They take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen into the air. The roots are the ones that soak up water and minerals. They also store food for the plant. So water from the soil enters the roots, and then it's carried up, and then it's carried to the leaves, and then it's carried to the different parts of the plant. Now let's look at the parts of a flower, or the main parts of a flower. Of course, is the what you have to understand is the pedicel, which is the stem which holds the flower. And then sometimes they have these bracts which are found here, but we don't have to know this. Then the sepals, which are the green parts of the flower, and they protect the flower in the bud stage. So protect the flower in the bud stage. And this would be the sepals. When the flower is closed and it's in the bud stage, then the sepals are going to be protecting it. Then we have the male part, which is called stamen. So men, you can remember it from the word men. This is the male part of the flower, and it is made up of two things: anthers and filaments. Now you can see the filaments just hold the anthers, and the anthers are actually four pollen sacs, and this, of course, is the filament which is going to hold this up together. We'll go a little more detail a little later. Then we have the pistil word is not used anymore. We call this the carpel now. And the carpel is made up of stigma, which is the upper part, which is the sticky part, which receives the pollen, and the style is the stem, and the ovary is the part which is going to become, finally, is going to become the fruit, and which is going to contain the seeds and the ovules, which are going to finally become the seeds. Now, another diagram which shows you the petals, which are, of course, the parts of the which can be large, which can be brightly colored, and these would probably more prominent in insect pollinated flowers, because we're going to be discussing two insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. So insect and wind pollinated flowers are going to be the two main types of flowers that we are going to discuss. And now you can see here, we can see here the sepals, which are the green parts at the base of the flower, and then we have this part where all of the structures are placed is the receptacle, just like when you're doing a flower decoration, you put some sort of a sponge at the base of it and then you stick the flowers into it. So receptacle, and then of course we have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So the ovary is this very large round structure which is just on top of the receptacle. Sometimes it's a little difficult in different diagrams when they give it to you in the exam. So just make it a mental note that it's the ovary and then it's the stigma, style, and ovary. And this is the female part. So you can remember it, female have style. And this is called carpel. The carpel is the whole structure. Stigma, style, and ovary together is called the carpel. And the male part is the men, as I said, stamen, and it's made up of the anther, which is four pollen sacs, and the filament, the stem, which holds it up. And of course, the filament will contain the xylem and the vessel, which is going to, the xylem and the phloem is going to contain the xylem and the phloem, which is going to provide water and nutrients, because the phloem is going to provide the sucrose for the respiration and the energy part, because it needs to grow. So the stamen is the male part, is made up of anther and the filament. The carpel is the female part, it is made up of the stigma, style, and ovary. And inside the ovary, what we're going to have is we're going to have the ovule. Could be one, could be many. And the ovule will finally become the seed. So the ovule will become the seed. The ovule will become the seed, and the ovary will actually become the fruit. So you imagine all the fruit that you eat, they're all ovaries. So an apple is an ovary, a mango is an ovary wall which you eat. You don't eat the seed, of course. But when you're eating peanuts, well, you're actually eating the seed, and the outer that woody type of shell in it is the ovary wall. So you should be correlating all this with the ovary wall and the seeds and what you eat, and I'll probably do that at the end of the video as well. Now coming to the functions or parts of a flower, now it's very simplified. Petals are often large and colored to attract insects, but these would be only in insect pollinated flowers. So insect pollinated flowers would have large petals, brightly colored petals. Now the sepals protect the flower while in the bud stage. The petiole or the stalk or the pedicel supports the flower to make it easily seen by insects and to be able to withstand wind. Nectary is a portion which is found in certain flowers, mostly insect pollinated flowers, and they produce nectar to attract insects. And then the stamen, the male reproductive part of the flower, made up of the anther and the filament. Anther contains four pollen sacs in which pollen grains are formed. So meiosis takes place here. In the anthers, meiosis takes place here, and pollens are actually the male sex cells or the male gametes. And the filament supports the anther. Now the carpel is made of the female reproductive part of the flower and made of the stigma, style, and ovary. A stigma is a sticky surface to the ovary through which the pollen tube is going to grow, and the style links the stigma to the ovary through which the pollen tube will grow. Now the ovary contains the ovules which develop into seeds, but the ovule also contains the female gamete. So the female gamete is also inside the ovule, and we'll talk about it now when we study pollination and fertilization. Now here is a diagram of a wind pollinated flower. Now in the wind pollinated flower, there are not any petals, they're not large petals, there's something which are greenish looking, which sometimes are called bracts. And then you can see the anthers are hanging outside, and it has a feathery stigma. And the pollen is blown by the wind, and of course the anthers are large and they're dangling outside the flower. And the stigma is feathery so as to increase the surface area to catch, possibly have a larger surface area, so that when the pollen is being carried by wind, so maybe one or two pollen hits these feathery stigmas, and that is able to then result in fertilization and seed formation. So feathery stigmas, pollen blown by wind, anthers hanging outside. Now, as you can see in this diagram, the insect and wind pollinated flowers are very different. Insect pollinated flowers have very beautiful, brightly colored petals, and they have the anthers, of course, inside the flower. The stigma is also inside the flower. Now, when you look at a wind pollinated flower, I mean, it's a little weird. The anthers are all outside. Filament is long and loose, and the anther is loaded with pollen. It dangles loosely from the filament, thus exposing the pollen. And the stigma is feathery. So the stigma is feathery and ideally adapted to catch the pollen. So it increases the surface area. But we've got to understand stigma, style, there'll always be an ovary as well. So these are the ovaries. Stigma, style, and ovary will be present. This will be the style. And then this will be the stigma. So stigma will be feathery and will increase the surface area for maybe catch a few pollen as the wind is going to blow the pollen along. And the feathery stigma increases surface area, so maybe we'll be able to catch a few pollen. Another diagram of a wind pollinated flower. I just want you to be very clear about how they look like. So wind pollinated flowers will have, as you can see here, the stamens, the anthers, and the filaments. And the stigmas, as you can see, are feathery stigmas, and then there's style, and then there's an ovary. And this whole thing is called a carpel. And the anthers and the stigma are the stamen, and they're sort of outside the flower. This is a little sort of confusing because you can see some sort of petal-like structures in it, but actually the feathery stigma is the main structure which is going to give a clue that this is a wind-pollinated flower. I remember this diagram coming in one of your papers. Now let's come to the topic of pollination. What is pollination? Pollination is actually the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Very simple. Transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Of course, we can explain it in a number of ways. Pollination process occurs when pollen grains from the male part of the flower, which is the anther, are transferred to the female part, which is the stigma of another flower. Once pollination occurs, then the fertilized flowers produce seeds, which enable the associated plant to reproduce or form the fruit. In other words, we can say pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma. The goal of every living organism, including plants, is to create offspring for the next generation. One of the ways that plants can produce offspring is by making seeds. So it is in a form of, it's a sexual reproduction, not asexual, in which you just plant a cutting or a leaf or a part of a stem and it'll grow into another plant. But this is now going to have a lot of genetic variation because the male gamete, which is the pollen grain, is going to go from one flower to another flower, and that is going to, of course, result in a variation. Now, pollination is of two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, self-pollination is pollen transfer within one flower, so from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Then it could be pollen transfer between flowers of one plant. This is one plant individual, so from one flower but on the same plant. And then cross-pollination is pollen transfer between flowers of different plant individuals. Like for instance, this is a red rose and this is a white rose. So pollen transfer from this to this or this to this is going to result in, it's going to be called cross-pollination. Please don't think it is between flowers of different species. That is not possible. It has to be the same flower. If it's got a white rose, then this is also got to be a red rose. It can't be between a red rose and a lily, or a red rose and a gladiola, or a red rose and a lily. So it has to be the same species. The species has to remain the same. It can't be, even if the pollen lands on another species, it will not germinate because every pollen grain would have, every stigma would have receptors for its own pollen grain, just like you have enzymes active site. So the stigma would have surface on which the pollen grain from its own species will only settle on it. Right? Stigma will have some sort of receptors on it on which the pollen from its own species is going to fall on it, and then it's going to germinate and a pollen tube is going to grow. Otherwise, it will not germinate. It will not germinate. Another diagram showing you self-pollination and cross-pollination. So self-pollination would be the anthers produce pollen and then they of course fall onto the same. So this is the stigma which is going to receive the pollen from its own flower. So this is ovule will then produce the female gametes. Now in cross-pollination, what happens? Pollen grains from the stamen sticks to a bee as it visits a flower to collect food. Number two, the bee travels to another plant of the same type. Pollen on the bee sticks to a pistil or the stigma of a flower on the other plant. So it falls onto the stigma of this other flower. So from the anther, it has now the pollen has been transferred from the anther to the stigma of the other flower on the same plant, but of the same plant, not on the same plant, of different, and this could be slightly different in colors. This could be slightly yellow, and this could be white, or this could be another shade of yellow. Because you see, this is why cross-pollination results in variation. Like a red flower, like a red rose and a white rose would result in seeds, and when you sow the seeds, they will give you pink roses. So that is why the colors are going to be variable, and that of course is very important in variation because if pollinators change, some colors will attract more pollinators, so there'll be more success stories. More of those flowers will develop because they will be the pollinators will be attracted by that specific color. Diagram explaining you pre-pollination, pollination, and post-pollination. So pollinator attraction, pollen dispersal or received, pollen germination and tube growth, and finally fertilization. And this will result, of course, in seed formation. Another very important topic, bee facts. Bees are responsible for 80% of all the pollination of the world. Honeybees have 5 eyes. Honeybees use the sun as a reference point. Tiny bits of pollen stick to the bees' legs. They drink nectar from the flowers. They make honey from the nectar. Bees help flowers to make seed by putting pollen from one flower onto the next. Now, the advantages of self and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen from anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower born on the same plant. It does not require any external agency. Both anthers and stigma mature at the same time. It can occur even when the flower is closed, produces homozygous offsprings, and does not introduce any variation. So, red roses will remain red roses. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower born on a different plant of the same species. An external agent, wind, water, insects, is always required. Anthers and stigma mature at different times. It occurs only when the flowers are open, produces heterozygous offsprings. Introduces variation. Red roses into white roses, all the seeds produce pink roses. So there's variation. Now, after pollination, there is fertilization. So, what is the summary of fertilization? Number one, the pollen grain lands on the stigma, absorbs the fluid, releases enzymes, and a pollen tube starts to grow from the pollen grain down the style, through the micropyle and into the ovule. Through the micropyle and into the ovule. So you can see there is the ovary, and then there is the ovule inside it, and then the egg cell is inside it. So ovary and the ovule, which you have to understand, this is the ovule. This is the micropyle, a hole which is going to allow the pollen tube to enter. So you're going to see the details here. You can see here the pollen tube growing down the style. So this is the style. So the pollen tube growing down the style, and then they've shown you this arrow. And then the pollen tube goes through the micropyle. And in this pollen tube, the two sperm nuclei or the male nuclei actually are discharged into the embryo sac, resulting in double fertilization. The fertilized egg zygote will develop into the embryo, and the fertilized central cell will develop into the endosperm. But we don't have to know this, so we can forget this. Now, the important thing is the ovule is going to develop into the seed. and the ovary is going to develop into the fruit. So we've got to understand now how this is going to happen. First, of course, was pollination, then it's fertilization, and then it's fruit and seed formation. So we've got to see it in this sequence. First, pollination, transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma, and then we have fertilization, and then we have fruit and seed formation. Now, I like the wording of this a little better than the previous one. Now, when a pollen grain germinates on the stigma, a pollen tube grows out of it. The pollen tube grows right through the style and into the ovary. The pollen tube enters the ovule through an opening in the ovule called the micropyle. The tip of the pollen tube bursts, releasing the two male gametes. So what has actually come, not the whole pollen hasn't come. The two main gametes have traveled. So the two male gametes have traveled here. It's actually only the nucleus which travels. So that is going to travel here and is going to come down. One male gamete fuses with the ovum, which is the female gamete. So male gamete fuses with the ovum, and this forms the diploid zygote. So the male gamete fuses with the ovum and forms the diploid zygote. The other male gamete fuses with the definitive nucleus to form the endosperm nucleus. You don't have to know this. So basically, we just have to know that the male gamete nucleus fuses with the female gamete nucleus and forms the diploid zygote. So this is the male gamete fusing with, and this has become the diploid zygote. Now this zygote is going to develop into the embryo and then into a little plant. Now another very beautiful diagram showing you fruit formation. The ovule is going to become the seed. So the ovule in A will become the seed in B. So this is B and this is A. So the ovule in A will become the seed and the ovary wall will become the fruit wall. So the ovary will become the fruit. The ovary wall will become the fruit wall. And sometimes that is what we eat. We eat the ovary wall. Now this is a very nice diagram showing you this exactly how this is going to happen. So the ovules are going to become the seeds, and you can see the diagram here, the seeds which were previously the ovules, and the ovary which has become the fruit. So you can see the remains of the style and stigma here, and these are the sepals. These are the sepals which you are seeing here, which were here. The sepals were here. Now you're going to be asked these questions in the paper. So these are the remains of the style and the stigma here. Why? Because you see, this is now developed into this. This is now developed into this. So you have to see it the other way around. You don't have to see a flower upside. You have to see the flower upside down now. Now you can see two types of fruit. The grape, which is a true fruit, and an apple, which is a false fruit. Of course, it's not in your syllabus, but it's nice to know all this. So the fruit, which is a swollen ovary, the seeds, which are the fertilized ovules, then the core ovary and the seeds inside, and of course we can see the pericarp and the edible food, which is the flower parts fuse and swell up, and that is the edible part. Now, what are the parts of a fruit? The fruit parts are epicarp, mesocarp, and endocarp, which together is all the ovary wall, the pericarp. And the seed inside is made of three structures. Number one, the embryo, which is the baby plant, and the endosperm or the cotyledons, which is the reserve food, and the seed coat, which is called the testa. Again, here an avocado seed pericarp, which is made up of the exocarp, mesocarp, and the endocarp, and then the seed inside. And this is an avocado fruit, and this is, of course, a mango fruit, which we are seeing the different parts of the fruit. Another very good diagram, the wall of the ovary becomes the pericarp, the thickened wall of the fruit. As the ovary grows, the other flower parts wither away and die. Mature fruits can be fleshy or dry. We have cherry, we have raspberry, and we have pineapple. The flower withers, the zygote develops, and the walls of the ovary thicken. The fruit that envelops the seed is formed. So the important thing is that the other parts of the flower are going to wither. The petals are going to wither off, the filament and the anthers are going to wither off, the stigma and the style is going to wither off. So this is all going to die, this is all going to die, the petals are going to die, and we're only left with the ovary, which is going to be developing into the fruit. And of course, as it becomes heavy, then it's going to sort of be the upside down, like this was straight like this, and now this is like this. Why? Because the fruit is heavier. You can see mangoes hanging from the trees, you can see apples hanging from the trees, you can see oranges hanging from the trees, and they're not straight, they're heavy, so they're going to fall down. They're going to sort of, they're not going to they're going to hang down because they're heavier. This part, the fruit part, is heavier. I would like to thank you all for all the positive comments that you make, and all these efforts of mine, which I spend hours making all these videos, they're worth all this effort. And I always appreciate when you all comment, whether they are good comments or bad comments, that doesn't matter. But as long as you comment and you are benefiting from these videos, that makes it very, very rewarding for me. Of course, the reward is all going to be from Allah, which I want, not from you all. But I must thank you all for writing all these positive comments, sometimes WhatsApping me these very nice messages. And thank you once again. Thank you very much for watching. We completed 16.3.8. The rest of it will go in the next video on this part, which is 16.3, which we were unable to complete in this video.